Hi, Alan Stratton from Woodturning. I attended the AAW symposium in Raleigh, North Carolina this past summer, and when I come home from such an event, I just have to try and do many of the things that I saw in demonstrations. This is the case with one of those demonstrations by Pascal Oudet. He uses French oak and turns very flat discs out of the oak and then lets them warp and crack. I did not have his oak. I had some nice fresh green pear, but it didn't quite turn out the same, but it's still an interesting exercise to turn something very thin in the cross-grain section and then bleach it and see how it comes out and see the interesting effects of almost a wood landscape, if you will. So let's turn these end-grain discs out of pear wood. As Pascal Oudet explained in his demonstration, he only uses green timber, in his case oak from France. My wood is pear wood, fresh from a recent storm. Using my electric chainsaw, I'm cutting this log to have fresh surfaces for this project. My electric saw is nice to use in the shop since it does not generate any fumes. It is adequate for this diameter of wood. I've examined the wood to choose the best face. I'll mount the opposite face out first. Now for mounting, I'm using my plastic disc to find a good center. There is the pith, but it is not necessarily the center, and I don't recall him saying whether he uses the pith center or the absolute center. Next, I'm pressing the wood against a large wood faceplate using only the live center to hold the wood. Since I have a nice flat side on one side of the wood, this works great. Now I need to face off the wood and cut a tenon for the next mount. Now I can reverse the wood into a chuck mount. I'll keep the live center in place for a bit of security. A rubber stopper prevents damage from the point of the live center. The best face is now towards the live center. I need to do very little work on this side, but I do need a good clean cut and a very flat side. With most of the work done, I can remove the live center and clean up that area. I'll check for flat with the square. The harder work is from the headstock side. I'm cutting back about 1 inch of the diameter until I have about 1/8 of an inch or less remaining on the edge. I think he could get 3 millimeters from his oak. From my experience with the first 2 discs, I'm going to stop just under 1/8 of an inch. This pear was cut in the summer, therefore the bark is very loosely attached to the sapwood. Again, I learned in my first 2 discs that I cannot save the bark. However, at this stage I can easily break it off by hand. As I get to the last portion, very thin, I have to be very careful with my tool and cuts. Worse yet, the thin wet wood starts to wobble and warp. This wood is throwing off a lot of free water. My shirt is soaked. Once I get the thin portion nice and uniform, I can start cutting back the next inch of diameter. I can quickly hog off the wood up to about 1/4 inch to the thin section. Then I have to slow down and carefully cut back to make this section match the thin section cut earlier. At this depth, my calipers do not reach. The blade of my square is useful to check as long as I can compensate for the warping, wobbly wood. The next diameter to be reduced takes the wood down to the chuck, and I have to avoid cutting into it. But the process is about the same. Waste the wood to close to the thin section, then very carefully cut the remaining wood to make the thin section uniform. The thin wood is very pliable and wobbly. Now, avoiding the chuck is harder. I take a moment to freshen the edge on my gouge. This is getting dicey. With very little wood left, I cut just very thin, just a little away from the thin section. Finally, I can twist off the wood with no risk of tearing out the thin portion. Finally, I mount a sanding disc to remove that small rise in the center. I place the freshly turned disc in a paper sack to temper the environment and let it warp into an interesting landscape. I bleached each disc. I'll show bleaching in a separate video. Despite the wood being dry, the water from the bleaching introduced even more warping and cracking. I've come to the conclusion that pear wood is not the best choice for this project. Pascal used oak, which has a more pronounced grain structure and connecting rays. Pascal would sandblast his discs, which highlighted that grain structure. Sandblasting will not work for pear. Still, I have 3 interesting thin cross-grain discs with a lot of warping and cracks. While this has been an interesting project, I'll wait until I can source a nice piece of wet oak to try again. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe on my website, tell your friends, and send me your comments and questions. Every week I make a new woodturning video. Please wear your full face shield anytime that lathe is running. Until next week's video, this is Alan Stratton from As Wood Turns.